Hello and welcome to Moderate Fantasy Violence, a podcast about pop culture and the world around it. I'm Nick.
And I'm Alastair.
And in today's episode, we are talking about the new Spider-Man movie, Spider-Man Homecoming. We've also got the first episode of the new season of Game of Thrones, the most penultimate one ever. And we'll be looking at season 2 of Preacher, the adaptation of the Garth Ennis, Steve Dillon comic that was so big in my teenage years. And finally, we'll be seeing what Alastair thought of my recommendation of Descender by Jeff Lemire and Dustin Nguyen from last week. And if you stick around to the very end, there may also be a chance to win some money. Well, kind of internet money. If you stick around to the very end, you might find out what I actually mean. But before all of those things, Alastair, what have you been doing since last time?
I went to see a really funny stand-up comedian. His name's Daniel Kitson. I think he's quite infamous in stand-up comedy circles in that he's built up quite a following but doesn't actually do performances or tours that often. I think he's kind of described as the comedian's comedian. I think it's what he does, I guess, is it's not sort of like observational comedy, or it's not particularly accessible. He does these kind of storytelling comedy, I guess is where you put it, in that he tells like this a very long story in a sort of rambling way, which obviously has quite a lot of funny twists and turns along the way in it. The way he sort of does is he stands on stage and tells his bizarre interconnecting stories, and he kind of jumps from one story to another and has like different tangents and different themes, and they kind of like interlock. But it is just also just really, really funny.
I thought the comedian's comedian was Stuart Lee.
Yeah, well, Stuart Lee's actually quite popular now.
Well, Stuart Lee's the comedian's comedian in that he does a lot of comedy about comedy.
Yeah.
A lot of his comedy is, I shall now deconstruct the very notion of what it means to do a stand-up set.
Yeah, I guess in that way, Stuart Lee's quite meta. But I think, despite his best efforts, Stuart Lee is like really popular. And I guess he's not so much a thing that's like in the comedy community for comedy fans. He's now like, he's got shows on the BBC and a column in The Guardian. So, you know, obviously I like Stuart Lee. I think he's really funny, and I'm glad he's successful and got a bigger audience. I'm not trying to throw shade at Stuart Lee, but I don't know. I think Daniel Kitson has deliberately avoided mainstream success, or at least it's eluded him.
He's a name that sounds familiar, but then again, that could be because I've heard of quite a few people called Daniel and at least 2 famous-ish people with the surname Kitson. So,
yeah,
not really sure I know him specifically. His style sounds a bit like Daniel Lewis Tyson, who is someone I follow on Twitter who does sort of long, rambling stories and is also called Daniel.
Yeah.
So, who knows?
His style is similar to Daniel Lewis Tyson. His style is similar to Stuart Lee in that sense. He doesn't do the repetition, the slow-moving repetition that Stuart Lee does, but it's more of a long chat rather than like sort of joke sort of format. What I really liked about Daniel Kitson, though, is his ability to take like some really, really complex political issues and kind of distill them down to their kind of core elements in a sort of accessible and funny way. He does touch on politics like a lot in his set. One of the stories that he keeps coming back to is his conversation he had with a homeless person outside a restaurant. And he kind of goes into all the political and social ramifications of, should you give money to homeless people, you know, or should you give it to, you know, directly to them? Should you give it to homeless charities? Should you just like try and talk to them and help them? Or, you know, all the kind of issues and debates. He managed to summarize the whole thing really well and in quite a funny sort of spot-on way, which is like impressive. They managed to distill so much complexity.
Sounds good. Yeah. In fact, The Comedian's Comedian is also a podcast presented by Stuart Goldsmith. Anyway, I'm getting off track.
That's another Stuart. Anyway, so what have you been up to since we last chatted, Nick?
Well, I have been rereading another big trilogy of books, but happily more big in terms of fame than big in terms of length this time after the Jerusalem epic. I have been rereading the His Dark Materials series by Philip Pullman. So I've read the first 2 now. I've read Northern Lights and The Subtle Knife, and I will soon be embarking upon The Amber Spyglass. This, of course, is all in preparation for him releasing the first book in his new companion trilogy, which I think is called The Book of Dust. I think that's the name of the book rather than the trilogy. And that's coming out in October, I think?
Yeah.
I should be able to get through Amber Spyglass in time for October, you'd hope.
Yeah, The Book of Dust coming in October, which I am very excited to read. I love the Northern Lights, you know, his Dark Materials trilogy. Yeah, I really, really enjoyed reading them, and I'm looking forward to more stuff in the same universe.
Yeah, the first 2 are quite good. Not quite as epic as I remember. But I think I was young when I read them. I probably had lower standards for epic. I hadn't yet seen, Game of Thrones or Twin Peaks: The Return. And I'm pretty sure when I was young, I never actually read The Amber Spyglass, which is odd because I finished The Subtle Knife yesterday and it ends on a massive, massive cliffhanger. So I don't know what Child Nick was really doing, to be honest. Not very much, it seems.
The Amber Spyglass is pretty epic. I seem to remember it has the enormous battle. The kind of the end of the trilogy. And correct me if I'm wrong, but the Amber Spyglass I think is bigger than the other 2 put together.
Well, I've got the physical books here, so yeah, it's certainly about the same in these paperbacks I've got.
Because I've got the big hardback edition that's all 3 together, and I seem to remember that when I was at the end of The Subtle Knife, I wasn't even halfway through the entire volume.
Part of me always thinks it's a shame when these things become massive, massive success bricks towards the end of the series. I mean, I'm pretty sure the Book of Dust is going to be another massive brick. To be fair, people have been waiting for this for 15 years, so it would be in some ways disappointing to them if it was only, a relatively brief book like the first two were.
Yeah, well, I'm excited for the new book. I think we'll be covering on the podcast.
But it'll be a bit of a reading challenge, but we might be able to fit it in somehow.
Yeah, he's a good writer, and it's such a brilliantly evocative world that he creates in the novels.
The way the world building sort of slowly unspools is probably the best part of the whole thing. Especially the idea of dust and the sort of magical, you know what it is, yet you don't know what it is of it, the sort of feeling it evokes. It's all very nicely done. I mean, having not read the third one, I'm sort of curious how exactly he's going to pale that off. So I'm interested. I think I may have had the very, very end spoilt for me due to it just becoming, part of the pop cultural osmosis of, oh, everyone's read this, we can talk about it. But the actual, plot details along the way I don't really know about, so I'm excited to finally get into that. Okay, and now a drop in so last minute that we didn't mention it in the intro. Since we recorded the bulk of the podcast, they have announced that Jodie Whittaker will be the 13th Doctor in Doctor Who, and as big Doctor Who fans, we thought, and as we were meeting back up again on Skype to record some Game of Thrones stuff, we thought we would briefly chip in on that. Alastair, what do you think of this news?
I'm very pleased. I'm certainly encouraged that the next series will be good. As listeners to this podcast will know, I was a big fan of Peter Capaldi. I thought he was very good in the role. But I guess Doctor Who moves forwards and change is kind of in the nature of Doctor Who. And it is ridiculous that it's taken until the 13th person to play the Doctor that they've cast a woman. And I think they've chosen someone who's got a lot of talent. A good actress, Jodie Whittaker. I haven't seen Broadchurch, which I think she's most well known for, but she was in Attack the Block, which is a great sort of comedy science fiction film. She was very good in that. Yeah, I've got every confidence that she'll do a great performance as the Doctor and, kind of make the part her own in the same way that, Capaldi, Smith, Tennant, Eccleston and all the others before her have. She'll bring her own take to it. And yeah, I was a bit sort of, before they announced the casting new Doctor, I was a bit uncertain of this new series, partly because new showrunner Chris Chibnall hasn't produced some of the strongest Doctor Who episodes so far.
Yeah.
So I was a bit uncertain of what this new series would be like, but my hopes have been raised by him making a bold, interesting, and I think very good casting decision.
I don't know, I think to be honest, it reached a point where there was a mass building behind this, a sort of, a critical mass, some might say, which made it seem kind of inevitable. It helped, I guess, by Stephen Moffat spending a lot of his last 3 years with Peter Capaldi setting up the notion that Time Lords could also be women, which did make it seem pretty inevitable that this would happen in the next generation or two. And it does make sense to capitalise on the fact that everyone pretty much liked and accepted Michelle Gomez as Missy, so this is probably the time to go all in and do a female Doctor. And yeah, I watched Broadchurch. I remember Jodie Whittaker being pretty good in that, so I've got no problem with the casting. Honestly, I can't even think of what else another male, especially white male Doctor could have really brought to it energy-wise that we haven't seen from the 4 Doctors we've already had. So, in the name of making it seem a bit new and different, this is fine by me. Really, I too haven't loved Chris Chibnall's past episodes, but this does give me a bit more faith in his abilities and not just go hard conservative. And to be honest, even if he does make a very sort of meat and potatoes, unadventurous Doctor Who series, there is arguably value in, just seeing a female Doctor do that stuff. So this does definitely increase my interest in that series. As I say, I think because they very much waited until the moment very much felt like it was inevitable, a lot of people's reactions has been more sort of satisfied nodding, yeah, this is about the right time, rather than massive shock or surprise. But yeah, at least they got it at around the right time. I think this was probably the last generation where they could have done it and people would have thought, yes, this is about the right time, rather than, yeah, whatever, mate, you should have done this 5 years ago.
There certainly was like a consensus when Matt Smith was stepping down for them to do something different with the part, like people talking about, having a woman Doctor or maybe a non-white Doctor. Patson Joseph was a name that was mentioned, some other people. And I think there was a sense that they felt that was an appropriate time. And then they announced Peter Capaldi, who obviously a very well-respected actor, some great parts under his belt. And also after 2 young Doctors, going for like an older Doctor was a bit of a change. There was a feeling with some people that, well, we'll give you this one because it is Peter Capaldi, but then there definitely is a strong feeling that The next time, it needs to be, at least someone different.
There's definitely it is Peter Capaldi effect. And yeah, I think they did get away with that, but I think there aren't that many actors, certainly actors who are willing to do Doctor Who, and who the BBC can afford, and whatever, who have a sort of, it is him effect. I mean, to use the obvious example, the guy rumoured for the parts for a few weeks before it was announced as Jodie Whittaker was Chris Marshall from My Family, Love Actually and other things. And although he is a sort of likeable enough British actor, there's not really a, it is Chris Marshall effect. He doesn't really excite the same, yes, he's such a beloved presence that we'll cast aside our strongly held beliefs. So yeah, I think they've correctly chosen their moment there.
Yeah, before we form any more opinions, you should wait till at least there's a trailer out, or maybe even, God forbid, form opinions after we've seen some of the episodes. But I know my hopes are raised. I'm interested, certainly, and reserve judgment till we see the new showrunner and the new Doctor in action.
Speak for yourself, mate. I'm forming my entire opinion based on her one line at the end of the Christmas special.
Fair enough. Well, then we'll at least wait for that.
Yeah. See you in a few months, guys, for my comprehensive verdict.
Our first main segment of this episode will be Spider-Man Homecoming, a new outing for Peter Parker as part of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. This time, Peter Parker's in high school, and he teams up with Iron Man to fight the Vulture. Nick, you're a much bigger Spider-Man fan than me, so I'm going to throw this over to you to get your view on the film.
Well, yep. As has come up on the podcast before, I've liked Spider-Man since I was quite young. Spider-Man is the best superhero, I think. Certainly, it's a thin line between him and Batman. Yes, though I really liked this. Spider-Man Homecoming, like a lot of the good recent superhero films, has taken an angle on the superhero thing rather than letting it become slightly generic. And on this occasion, the angle is this sort of teenage high school comedy thing where they've partly pushed the idea of big Spider-Man interfering with Peter Parker's life, and also this idea that Spider-Man is a deeply fallible character. Because, I don't know, I mean, I have lurked in slightly more hardcore Spider-Man fandom, much more hardcore than me. And there does seem to sometimes be an annoyance with Spider-Man being portrayed as unlucky or a loser or someone who's perpetually doomed to failure. But I always feel like that's, especially during this teenage phase of the character, quite key to the whole thing. Generally, if Spider-Man says, I'm going to do this, he either shouldn't succeed, or it should be much, much harder than he expected. And if he's in this film, he will probably bounce off about 5 solid objects whilst trying to achieve it, because it turns out the joke of Spider-Man tries to do something, clumsily messes it up and smacks into a wall or a bin or something, has almost infinite repeat potential. So yeah, Spider-Man reimagined as a sort of school comedy. As a fan of the Ultimate Spider-Man comics, which we discussed a few weeks back, I'm definitely here for that, and I think they did it well with a lot of charm and a lot of fast-moving, funny action. Tom Holland is very, very charming. He's got the sort of nervous energy and the sort of likability you want in that specific part. And sorry, Andrew Garfield, but unlike you, he actually looks like a teenage boy rather than a 20-something man in a hoodie. So I can see why they've scheduled him to do 4 films in the next 2 years to try and get as much of this out of him as they can before he, starts looking his age, because I think he's actually 20. But yeah, I'll probably give Alastair a chance to talk now. But yeah, I thought this was the funny, charming Spider-Man as the sort of try-hard, lovable loser film that I've been waiting for years.
I'm glad you liked it. I really liked it as well. You're right, it's very, very funny. I think even for a Marvel film, it was very funny. We talked before about there seems to be a sort of winning formula that Marvel does really well of kind of action plus jokes. And this film, I think, really certainly delivered on the jokes and sort of weighted more heavily towards that. There's some scenes when I was pretty much falling out of my cinema seat laughing. There's a great bit when Spider-Man has to interrogate a sort of low-level gangster guy, and it's just Spider-Man's just terrible at interrogation. It's everything goes wrong, and they end up discussing their favourite places in Queens to buy sandwiches from.
And that gangster is played by Donald Glover, which never hurts.
Yeah, because that guy is also, like I say, really good and really funny in that scene. I just like the bit when he sticks into his car with his spider web, and then Spider-Man's like, oh, that will dissolve in about 2 hours, and the guy's like, hey, I've got ice cream, you can't just leave me standing here. Also, other good supporting characters. I really liked the slightly sort of strange take they took on the character of MJ, long-standing Spider-Man character, by making her this kind of moody teenager who's, well, not the main love interest in this film, but is continuously in the background just looking disapproving and with a sort of, slightly glum expression. But every time she appeared, she had something funny to say. I like the bit when Spider-Man ends up in detention and MJ's there, And the teacher's like, you don't even have detention. And she's like, I like sketching people who are in despair. And she's got like a notepad with a picture of the teacher on it, and goes, see, it's you. Yeah, the density of jokes was very high.
Yeah, but technically her being MJ is a spoiler because it's not actually, air quotes, revealed until the very end of the film. Unfortunately, that's also one of the bits that didn't really work for me because it just felt... I don't know, I was quite happy with her just as Michelle, or just as general, quirky, fun character. And then the my friends call me MJ bit was a bit sort of... This is a level of slightly wanky fan service I didn't actually need.
Yeah.
You've done a decent enough job of just going, this is a new take on Spider-Man. There's no Harry Osborn, there's no J. Jonah Jameson, there's no Gwen Stacy or MJ. And it works. It feels fresh and fun and good. You didn't really need to go, wait, she's secretly MJ. That got more of an eye roll than a, oh my god, I was so excited. And I'm the actual Spider-Man fan here.
I kind of liked that a bit in that, well, I like the character mainly, so maybe I was willing to forgive what they did with it. But I guess the sort of, I don't know, some continuity with the kind of, I guess, the ongoing Spider-Man story they're leading to. And it was good at the end, but you are completely right in what you say, that it's nice to do a fresh take on Spider-Man, like you say, no Harry Osborn. They didn't do the origin story, which was much appreciated because I've sat through enough cinema versions of Spider-Man origin stories for one lifetime. They didn't do Uncle Ben's death again, and they didn't do all the other bits and pieces.
Yeah, although they didn't do Uncle Ben's death, which I agree is good, and we've seen that. I would have accepted maybe a short flashback or some sort of, montage version over the credits or something, but I definitely didn't need to see it reenacted again. I was quite surprised they didn't even mention him. I mean, I guess, but, they were very, very, this is a funny film, the energy is humour driving it forward. We don't want to have even the one scene where he looks glum about his Uncle Ben. But I really thought he'd get at least a line.
He was mentioned in the Captain America 3, so... But I don't know, maybe they feel like, oh, that's done, let's move on. But I think, like you say, they probably were like, okay, we're going for funny Spider-Man, so being miserable about the death of his adopted sort of stepdad, not probably the vibe we want from this film.
I could live with it, because ultimately it's not as if I'm lacking for films about sad men who are motivated by the death of their mentor or father figure, to be honest. Yeah. It's not as if I need to throw my rock far to find one of those. I could live with Spider-Man steering around that. It just, as a Spider-Man film, felt slightly odd that there wasn't any even mention of Uncle Ben beyond that one vague comment about mustn't upset Aunt May because she's been through a lot, or whatever it was.
Yeah. The other thing, obviously, is that the mentor-father figure in this film is filled by Tony Stark and Iron Man. And that relationship is quite well developed, so I guess they felt there's only room in the film for one father-mentor figure. And yeah, I thought, Robert Downey Jr. is obviously really good as Tony Stark. He's been doing the part a lot, but he's still very good at it. And he again had some good funny lines and things like that. He's got a lot of charisma. It was interesting, he was like a presence in the film and was like in the background. He didn't like overshadow anything in the film. It's not like you're just waiting for the next time Iron Man turns up. Spider-Man had enough strength to stand on his own.
A lot of people were sort of, their main worry / sort of snarky joke about the film based on the trailers and the posters were, oh, I'm looking forward to the new film Iron Man Homecoming, because there was quite a lot of focus on the fact that Iron Man's in it in the trailers and the posters, I guess, as shorthand for, it's in the cinematic universe now, we're in the cinematic universe now, we matter, for the love of God, come and see our film, after the last one.
Yeah.
But yeah, thankfully, pretty much all of the Tony Stark, Robert Downey Jr. scenes were in the trailer, much as the trailers did also give far too much away, to complain about something slightly different. I did feel they did a good job of not overusing Tony Stark. I mean, even to the extent that they brought in the Happy Hogan character, played by Jon Favreau, who I didn't realise they still had available to them, but fair enough.
But that was funny.
Him as the sort of long-suffering Stark contact. I think, well, A, he is very good at it, and B, it did mean that they could keep Downey Jr. off screen for a bit to stop him upstaging the lead character. Although, for the record, my friend Ali did Facebook in response to our post about this podcast to say she wouldn't have minded more Robert Downey Jr. So there are differing opinions out there.
I heard a rumour that it was sort of contractually dependent on Sony leasing Spider-Man back to Marvel because they own the rights to Spider-Man. Their requirement was to have Iron Man in the film because I think they thought Iron Man plus Robert Downey Jr. equals money, which is, I think, something they didn't get out of Spider-Man plus Andrew Garfield.
Well, yeah, it's just shorthand for this is in the cinematic universe, isn't it? It's just to make it, because nothing embodies the Marvel Cinematic Universe, like it or not, like Downey Jr. as Iron Man. Well, I guess, and also Captain America 4 at this point, but still, it is. For the mainstream, not hardcore fandom audience, I think that is still what says Avengers like nothing else. They are still, I think, still kind of seen as his thing.
Yeah. Also, speaking of Captain America, he had a couple of very good cameos in this film, like as appearing as a guy in videotapes that are shown to high school kids. Again, in the detention scene, they're made to watch Captain America dressing them down on videos. And I do like there's a bit where the teacher kind of just goes, well, I think this guy may be technically a war criminal, but the state's not paying for new tapes. Again, that was another very funny joke.
Yeah, exactly. You know, if you're going to acknowledge your continuity, it's fine if you acknowledge it, as long as you then just turn it into a joke afterwards. But yeah, no, those were good. And yeah, Michael Keaton, actually. I'm surprised we got this far without Michael Keaton. He's great. He's actually, in a Marvel Cinematic Universe that has a slight problem with boringly evil villains who are just evil, and who don't really get enough screen time to actually develop their reasons for being evil. I thought Michael Keaton was really good. I thought he actually had a coherent reason for being evil. You know, you could understand why he was pissed off, even if, like all good villains, he took his valid point a bit too far when he started, you know, stealing things and killing people.
Yeah, I thought Michael Keaton was excellent. I mean, he's very good at playing the kind of stoic leading man, as he's done in, you know, like Batman films and done in like Birdman and things like that. And this is quite good, him sort of subverting his kind of stoic hero by being like a stoic villain. And also I like the way his character broadened out the cinematic universe, in that he's a villain who's managed to piece together his superpowered vulture suit out of basically the debris left behind by Avengers in their previous outings, which kind of goes to show that, yeah, what does happen to all the stuff they end up lying around, and what if someone did kind of gather it together and, you know, try to use kind of Ultron technology plus like alien technology to become a villain. So, you know, I like that way how it broadened out the universe and kind of, I don't know, made it seem a bit more realistic.
Yeah, but yeah, we've talked a bit about how, you know, they've used Iron Man as the big obvious, look, it's in the cinematic universe, shout out on the posters. But I think, yeah, the best use of the cinematic universe in this film is the stuff about the Michael Keaton character being screwed over by the government for this sort of clean-up contract. And sort of the way that sort of weaves in the old continuity in a way that makes sense and gives his character a coherent motivation without it feeling a bit sort of, look at us, we're using the cinematic universe, we matter now. So yeah, no, I thought that was really good. It obviously helped by the fact that Michael Keaton did do this sort of normal-ish guy who got screwed over and has a valid reason to feel upset, but is also taking it far too far thing. Really, he played it really well, and obviously there's a twist about 3/4 through the film, which is amazing, and I'm not going to spoil it because why should I? But it's great, and it leads to some other really good scenes with the Michael Keaton character, and he does play them all very well. And even better, the final action scene in this superhero film isn't stupidly too long.
Yeah, I'd agree with all of that. I just want to echo that the twist scene is really, really good, and the bit that follows that is probably my favourite bit of the film, and it's because Michael Keaton is such a good actor and plays it so well. And also Tom Holland is very good and plays off Michael Keaton well. I think, as we said before, I think chemistry between Spider-Man and his villains, and also like Peter Parker and the non-villain version of his villains, is kind of an essential ingredient of Spider-Man, and they did that really well. I mean, I think I said before, the best example of this is Sam Raimi's Spider-Man 2, when obviously there's Dr. Octopus is facing off against Spider-Man, but also Peter Parker has a relationship with Otto Octavius before he becomes Dr. Octopus, in that he's like his teacher at university. And
yeah,
it was a really good way of how kind of there's personal relationships going on as well as like superhero adversarial relationships. And they do that really well in this film. I think that obviously that's an important part of any superhero film, but I kind of feel like with Spider-Man it's even more of an essential element, because Spider-Man has this much more kind of I'm a regular guy sort of thing, so regular everyday relationships need to be an important part of the story.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's why traditionally the best Spider-Man villain is often Norman Osborn, because he's his best friend's father, which lends a certain amount of easy relatability to it. The Vulture in the comics, of course, is nothing like the Vulture here, but to be honest, I don't really mind, because they've massively improved it. There's a few fun shout-outs, and the costume is a nice sort of, the fluffy collar around his bomber jacket looks a lot like the features of the original Vulture costume, which is nice, but they haven't felt the need to be beholden to it, which is, again, pretty much what I want from my superhero films.
Yeah, I guess they feel that they're doing a less well-known Spider-Man villain. They don't have to be as faithful to the comics, because less people will know where they deviated from it. Like, I had no idea that this Vulture was different to the Vulture, because I don't really remember the Vulture from that Spider-Man animated show I watched when I was a kid. It had the kind of witty, wisecracking Spider-Man in it that we have in this film, which was, I think, not in the Sam Raimi or the Andrew Garfield Spider-Man so much.
Yeah, pretty much. There's a bit more of an effort to do it in the Garfield ones, but it didn't really pull it off to anywhere near the same extent, mostly because I don't know, I think they felt they were going for mostly a quite sort of somber atmosphere in the Andrew Garfield ones, and having Spider-Man constantly babbling would, I guess, have taken people out of it. Yeah, I don't know. The logical forefather of this film, to me, was a lot of the Ultimate Spider-Man comics, which have a lot of this sort of teen angst, constant babble.
High school setting.
Yeah, going on. I mean, there are elements of it that have also been taken out of the Miles Morales comics, like him being in this extremely academic school, and the best friend character, Ned, is basically a character for the Miles Morales run, except he's called Ganke. in that. Miles Morales is a guy who became Spider-Man after Peter Parker died in the Ultimate Spider-Man comics.
I thought the Ned character was very good, though. Again, he was also very funny, and him and Peter Parker had a good sort of bantery back and forth.
He was good. I think Peter Parker's only best friend character in the comics was Harry Osborn, and I guess he was very much on the list of things we are not going to do again because they've been done to death by previous films. So I guess that's why they had to go ahead and pull the Ganke character out of the Miles comics.
I liked that Ned seemed like a more relatable friend to Peter Parker. A strange thing how Peter Parker's supposed to be, I don't know, quite poor, or at least sort of like, lower middle class or whatever you want to call it. Class obviously works different to the States than it does here in Britain. But also it's a bit strange how he knocked around with this guy who's basically like a billionaire or the son of a billionaire. And it always seemed a bit like, is this just so that he can end up at a lab and get bitten by a radioactive spider? The way it worked now is like, it's a fairly regular school, maybe, slightly preppy, but not hugely exclusive. And Spider-Man has like regular New Yorkian friends and does things like, goes to New York delis and, helps his mum with the shopping or goes to Chinese restaurants in his free time. I liked it.
Yeah, it was a great film. I've seen a few reviews sort of say I didn't feel it was really about anything, and I guess, I don't know, it didn't perhaps reach for any massively lofty themes, but to be honest, I thought the groundedness of it was in many ways part of the appeal. It's just a film about Spider-Man being a guy, and I guess that does sort of preclude it from really reaching for anything. But I think there was an attempt to join Spider-Man's battle with the Vulture on into him realising he was more of a down-to-earth character and he shouldn't get too carried away with this whole I want to be an Avenger thing.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think if it was about anything, it was about being a teenager. Normal teenage things like high school romances and classes and detention and school bullies a bit, or at least, kind of people at school who don't like you. And, it was kind of about being a teenager and how, being a superhero, casts a shadow over your regular teenage life.
Yeah, I think it's always what Spider-Man's about, and I think this film captured it really nicely. As I say, I don't know, I would have to actually rewatch this a bit and maybe rewatch the first two Raimi films to actually form a proper league table in my mind. But I think it's the third best one easily, and it could even challenge for second. I think it's a very strong Spider-Man film. Especially, it's the sort of Spider-Man film I like, as a big fan of the accident-prone teenager version. So yeah, I'm happy. Thumbs up. Okay, and now it's time for the first episode of the penultimate season of Game of Thrones, the fantasy drama set in a fictional world that closely resembles some sort of weird vision of Britain, where everyone fights each other whilst continuously ignoring the threat of evil elves or something from up north. I think we're going to go into this with full spoilers, because to be honest, if you're overly concerned with Game of Thrones spoilers, then surely you've seen the episode at this point, 4 days after it airs. So yeah, without that much further ado, Alastair, what did you think?
Yeah, it was a good opening to the series, strong. It sort of followed the pattern that most opening episodes of Game of Thrones series go through, which is you kind of get a brief check-in with every character where they're going sort of on their story. Although now the cast is a bit thinner because so many people died in the last couple of series, it does mean that some people got 2 scenes worth of action. We had 2 Arya scenes, including a very good opening scene where she poisons all the Freys who betrayed her and her family. And then she got another appearance later on when she ran into Ed Sheeran in the forest. Yeah,
as you say, it was certainly a Game of Thrones premiere, although due to that cast thinning you mentioned, it has now reached a stage where they don't need 2 episodes to check in with everybody. I think we did cover most of the major characters there. I mean, I suppose we don't know exactly what the Sand Snakes are doing, but somehow I'll get through the next week of my life without finding out what the Sand Snakes are doing, to be honest. Sorry, Sand Snakes, but you're not the best bit. Anyway, the 2 Arya scenes you mentioned were actually, I don't know, highlights might be rude, because there was a lot of other good scenes, but they were both quite good. For very different reasons. She did get sort of the 2 big kinds of Game of Thrones scenes. The big, wow, that was awesome scene, and the sort of nice, subtle characterization scene where people just have a normal yet somehow meaningful conversation. Possibly the first time we've seen Arya taking part in a normal chat without being there to secretly kill someone for about 3 or 4 years.
Yep, that's a good point. Yeah, I really like the scene of her with the soldiers kind of again when you dig into her character a bit more. And there's a great bit when she says she's on her way to King's Landing to kill the Queen. And this is like a moment of stunned silence, and they all like burst into laughter. And obviously, yeah, the impressive reveal that she murdered everyone in the Frey household.
Yeah, continuing the systematic death of everyone who isn't like a main character, just so they've got less things to worry about. Let's be fair, the only Frey I could have really picked out of a lineup was the main Walder Frey, old man played by David Bradley, and he died at the end of last season. So the death of all those nobodies before the credits was more of a sort of icing on the Frey genocide cake than anything else, but it was still good to see. I think although it was sort of, standard approach Game of Thrones premiere, it did feel a bit more exciting to me than some of them do, just because most characters did get a sort of vague new direction or new location, or they were in new company. Like, a lot of the time, you go back to the characters, they're still roughly where they usually are. Jon Snow's usually at the Wall, the Lannisters are always in King's Landing, Arya's been in Braavos for the last few years, the Hound is wandering around, other people are probably sitting in woods looking sad. That's Bran, of course. But yeah, this year, most characters were in sort of new locations doing new things, so it did actually feel like they were, kick-starting something rather than just going, yep, remember this? Still happening. Yeah,
there's definitely some momentum behind the plot in this thing. Like, we saw 2 scenes of Jon Snow and Sansa, preparing their defense of the north from both the Lannisters and the Army of the Dead. And yeah, we did get some substantial scenes that kind of develop the characters, what their relationships will be like in this series, what they're up to. There was it was more than just a kind of a quick check-in. It was definitely plot development in this first episode, which was good. Maybe a bit of a rift opening between Sansa and Jon Snow, especially as Sansa becomes increasingly confident.
Yeah, they've both had different experiences over the last few years, and it's nice to see that sort of coming through in how they interact with each other now. Having sat through 6 years of this, it's nice to get the feeling that it means something, and Jon Snow and Sansa have both been changed by their experiences by the time they eventually reunite. I don't know whether we can expect Arya to join them. Based on my very loose understanding of the geography, Arya's sort of heading in the opposite direction to Sansa and Jon.
Yeah.
But obviously, anything could happen in the next 6 episodes, but yeah.
She's in the south, I guess, heading further south to King's Landing.
Yeah, she's in an area where, even though winter has apparently come, it still looks not too snowy.
No, exactly. I don't know. I mean, winter may be here, but I don't know at what point the whole place will be covered in snow. And also we got a couple of scenes of Sam Tarly in the Citadel training. In fact, he maybe had 2 scenes, but each scene had quite a lot of bits to it, which meant he seemed to got a substantial amount of action. Including there was this montage of his life as a trainee maester in the Citadel, which seemed to be mainly emptying slop buckets and pouring out unappetizing looking food and occasionally fighting the urge to hurl. Oh, and stacking
books.
It's
a beautiful cutting between the slop buckets and the toilet buckets, just to make it clear that the two just aren't that far apart. To be honest, that montage mostly reminded me of the Hell montages they keep doing in Preacher, where you have to go through the same thing again and again and again. But obviously, Preacher isn't actually the first show to ever use that to depict repetitive mundanity. I guess Sam's new location is going to be their big new location for the year. Well, I say that, there could be more coming, but it's certainly the first big new place they've introduced where it looks like we actually will be spending some time and coming back to. So I guess they wanted to set it up. Plus, Jorah Mormont is apparently also there, so eventually he might have someone to talk to.
Yeah, that's another plot development. Yeah, because he disappeared in the last series after it was revealed that he was infected with the Doom, the thing that turns people into sort of stone.
The grayscale.
Yeah, grayscale.
He staggered off into the desert to find a cure, which, based on his cameo this episode, looks like that's going swimmingly. Yeah, mate. Just another one of Jorah Mormont's life endeavours that turned out really well.
Yeah, that man knows how to make good decisions.
Poor bastard.
I don't know if he'll have some essential revelation that'll be helpful to Sam. Sam uncovered there's a giant pile of dragon glass sitting underneath Daenerys' castle, so if Jon Snow wants dragon glass for his war against the White Walkers, I guess he might need to team up with Daenerys sooner rather than later.
Yeah, Daenerys' castle looking pretty lush, or at least pretty grand and imposing and dragony. I mean, when we last saw it, Stannis was sort of squatting there, and it looked like a bit of a horrible damp crypt. They just didn't show us all the amazing, majestic dragon statues that time.
Yeah, I thought it was supposed to be a ruin.
Stannis was just staying in the ruined side because he's that kind of guy. He doesn't allow himself luxury because then he might accidentally smile.
But yeah, he sort of abandoned that castle. They certainly upgraded the CGI because it did look much more impressive this time.
Well, it's the season premiere. I think that's this and whatever the big battle episode is this year. That's when they save all the money for. We probably now won't see Daenerys' dragons again for another 3 or 4 weeks.
Yeah, I can imagine we're probably building up towards some big epic Daenerys Lannister confrontation this series?
Oh yeah, I mean the really obvious raw way to break down the remaining 2 sort of micro seasons we've got left would be this season everyone fights each other, next season the survivors finally team up to fight the White Walkers, but hopefully it'll be a bit more complicated than that.
Yeah, that's probably the general plot arc they're going for, although I'm sure there'll be some bits of infighting amongst the surviving humans in the next series.
But yeah, obviously someone major has to get it.
Yeah, that's pretty much guaranteed.
Yeah, I feel like the only real question is whether Cersei gets it at the end of this season or next season. Either way, I feel like it's coming. And yeah, Pilau Asbeck from Borgen turning up as a sort of smiley, charismatic new villain. Well, not new villain, because he was in last season, although I don't remember him being quite so chummy.
The new king of the Iron Islands.
Euron Greyjoy, yeah.
Doing the smarmy, I'm just the villain you just want to punch sort of role.
I mean, to be honest, that's one argument for Cersei not dying this year. It is a sort of a move you could do when you're getting towards the end of your show, and you want to drag out the conflict with the main villain that little bit longer, bring in a sort of charismatic sub-villain who can get it in the penultimate series, so that the main villain doesn't have to get it until the final series. Finale. So yeah, possibly maybe Euron Greyjoy will be taking one through the face at the end of this season so that we can leave Cersei till next year.
Yeah, I think Cersei was the sort of person who might hang around to the very end before she finally gets it. So as well as obviously the Night King, I guess, is the other big villain that they're going to be keeping till right to the end.
I feel like with the way Game of Thrones has usually worked, it would be in some ways disappointing if it devoted the whole of its final 6 episodes to the heroes united fighting CGI zombie kings. I feel like the human infighting and backstabbing and swordy battles have always been the main appeal. So part of me kind of hopes the Night King gets killed surprisingly early and then we can go back to everyone fighting each other. But maybe that's not going to be the moral of the story.
I can imagine there'll definitely be some internecine struggle in the final series. I mean, like you say, that is the key appeal of Game of Thrones. I can't imagine they'll dispense of that in the final series to go for a straight good versus evil plotline. I can imagine, in the final series, there'll certainly be some form of people struggling and fighting against each other. It just remains to be seen who, and probably, there'll be some kind of conflict between the Lannisters and the Starks in the final series, because again, that's one of the main plots of the entire show. They've got to keep some of that around for next series.
Yeah, it's awesome though. It's all going to be over, but at the end of the day, they've, as we said, they've pared down the cast. It's clearly well on its way to being over. And yeah, this was a strong sort of catch up. It didn't quite sort of stomp in and shout, "Oh yeah, shit's getting real." It was still quite sort of measured. I felt it didn't really get my blood pressure really pumping. It was just sort of, "Oh yeah, we're back. It's good to be back. I like you guys," to the extent that some of you are likable.
Well, I got very excited when I heard the theme again, partly because it's been longer than normal as the series is later this year, so we had to wait longer than normal for our Game of Thrones. There are a few scenes that really kind of stir those intense feelings you get from Game of Thrones about something epic's about to happen, namely when Daenerys gets into her war room at the end and has a map of the entire Westeros and then goes, "Shall we begin?" Yeah, that kind of moment was like, oh yeah, definitely shit is getting real this series.
That was the closest I got to the aforementioned "oh yeah, it's going down" moment. But yeah, I didn't get the feeling we were really on a march to war. But I guess, they've still got 2 seasons to go, so maybe they're saving that for the actual final season.
Yeah.
But yeah, solid, admirably solid. Even Ed Sheeran's guest appearance didn't bother me that much, to be honest. They cleverly left him out of most of the actual acting. He just passed objects around.
Yeah, and did a bit of singing, which I guess is what they pay him for.
Yeah, on Sandor Clegane had a good scene, and by a good scene, I mean he did some enjoyable and nuanced swearing.
That was a very good scene. He was very moody, how them in that kind of abandoned farm cottage that had like the dead family in it, pretty bleak and pretty upsetting. And then also, actually a revelation at some point in that he did actually witness something magical, or something to do with the power of the Lord of the Light, which is certainly, I don't know, again, there's definitely a lot of movement in this series. Like, they are definitely pushing things forwards.
Yeah, it's nice that they're reminding us that plot line actually matters, because they haven't really leaned that hard on the Lord of the Light storyline for a bit, except for Melisandre whittering about it. Well, she's still alive somewhere, I guess. But yeah, it looks like that storyline, if they're bothering to remind us about it, presumably it's going to come to the fore at some point.
Yeah, and we haven't had a lot in the last few series of the Brotherhood Without Banners, which is the group that Clegane has teamed up with. So, I don't know, again, there's very much a sense of everything's moving forwards, and everything's moving forwards to a definite conclusion. Every character is on one of 2 paths. Either they're struggling to fight the White Walkers, or they're struggling to fight Daenerys and her army. I suppose all the third plotline, is like the internecine struggle between the Lannisters and the Starks for control of the north or possibly the whole Seven
Well, I
Kingdoms.
mean, there's a lot of push and pull in a lot of directions, to be fair. That's kind of the appeal. And yeah, the Lannisters, the one part of the storyline, the Lannisters are still roughly where they've always been. I mean, I suppose Cersei is queen now, which is progression. But there is something sort of quite sad and doomed feeling about how they've been whittled down to just two of them, still knocking around in the same old castle, kind of just waiting to die, really.
I did like Jaime's scene when he was almost basically saying, like, what is the point? Like, we've lost everything. What is, like, the point of hanging on? And then Cersei's very much like, but the point is to hang on.
Yeah, that probably won't end well for her. I'm sure there's a period where Jaime seems to be becoming likeable. He seems to have sort of retreated a bit from that.
Yeah, after he loses his hand. But I do get the sense that, I don't know, he seems to have a bit more of a conscience and generally feels that, like, that maybe the fact that everyone we care about is dead probably reflects poorly on our life choices. So you can see that coming in Jaime, and I think there might come to a point when, like, Jaime has to switch sides to, I don't know, I can see him teaming up with Jon Snow to fight the White Walkers, because he's kind of getting to the point when you can tell he wants a just fight. He's tired of this kind of corrupt madness that goes on in King's Landing.
Yeah, and of course, his signature move is to kill the monarch for the greater good. Who knows if he's going to have to pull that one out again.
Yeah, I can imagine there might be something coming in that regard when Cersei tries to blow up all of King's Landing at one point or something.
It would be in character for her, wouldn't it?
Yeah, that would be very much in character, yeah.
But yeah, that's been telegraphed so heavily that I kind of expect it to be some sort of trick in the end. Like, we'll get to a scene where Jaime's about to jump around the corner and stab Cersei, and instead someone stabs him.
Yeah, that's likely to happen, yeah. Maybe the Mountain. She's still got her impregnable fortress of a bodyguard.
It's always the bloody Mountain. Yep, no, bravo. I look forward to the next 6 weeks. It's fun to have new material to speculate about.
Well, as I think, saying about, like, the last couple of series were maybe a bit slower, although I suppose, like, the last series did move things on quite a bit at the end. This series has been quite fast and, got quite a lot out of the gate in, like, the first episode. So if anyone who's been criticising Game of Thrones for being too slow and not getting enough done, I think in this series we're going to see a lot done at probably quite a reasonable pace. So it's definitely moving into the final sprint.
Yeah, that's one of the things I'm interested in. Just how fast will it be? Will it actually be Game of Slows?
Maybe, who knows?
Game of Nose.
Well, it is known, isn't it, that they say?
I mean, yes.
Next, we'll be discussing the new series of Preacher from Amazon Prime, based on the comic by Garth Ennis and Steve Dillon. Jesse, Tulip, and Cassidy are now on the road, searching for God, who's abandoned heaven to walk the earth. The only issue is they're pursued by a supernatural cowboy who's been sent to kill Jesse. We've seen the first 4 episodes of the second series. We'll be discussing those and what our thoughts on it. Later, I guess we may revisit the whole thing. We'll have to let you know. Anyway, Nick, what's your thoughts on the second series so far?
Yeah, I'm pretty down with it. I think it felt like a fun step forward from season 1. It sort of preserved this sense of Tarantino-esque ultra-violent antics, whilst maybe adding a bit more of a story, possibly, which the first series, certainly for quite a while in the middle, felt a little bit like a selection of scenes linked together. Whereas this, it did feel perhaps a bit less aggressively stylised and aggressively in your face, and the characters seemed a shade more defined, and it still had a lot of fun moments and occasional ambitious moments of silliness, like when Hitler turns up, or there's another hilarious angel repeatedly being killed section, which I enjoyed a lot. So yeah, I think this is a good step forward. I think this is a lot closer to being the sort of show I imagined when they said we're doing a Preacher show. It's not a perfect masterpiece. I think the pacing is still a bit weirdly shonky, but yeah, it's a lot better than last year. Alastair, what did you think?
Yeah, the pacing is much better this time around, which is the main improvement in that. The first series was good, but it started strongly, then sort of tread water for a while, and then finished quite, strongly. I think this one's, they've gone for clearly a better, like, overarching story. Like I say, it's paced better, and, they kind of seem to get a sense that they're moving towards something incrementally, whereas in the first series, they seem to be going in circles for a while. There's also, the dark humour is really good. Like, there's a bit in the first episode when they have a shootout with the supernatural cowboy and the cops, and, like, there's quite a disgusting bit when they have to use, like, a dead person's intestines to siphon petrol into their car so they can get away, and then for the rest of the episode the car's just dangling some intestines behind it, and it's gross and dark but funny at the same time.
There's a bit in episode 3 where they go into a bar and say they're looking for God, and everyone seems to understand what they mean for once, and then I don't think it's a punchline that will be improved by me spoiling it in a podcast, but yeah, there's a good bit of ridiculous humour there.
Yeah, that was very funny.
But yeah, so it's a lot closer to what I think of as the spirit of the comics, in that they always did a good job of tying it into a plot direction, so the silliness felt a bit more grounded. Although the comics did a better job of properly stopping the plot for some emotional sincerity, whereas this is a bit full bore, let's go and do this, without really stopping for long emotional conversations.
They might do that later on in the series. I mean, so far there's been sort of movement in the kind of relationship, love plot line between Jesse and Tulip, so I don't know, they might be building towards some more moments of emotional sincerity between the two in the near future or later in the series. Because that does seem to be one of the main thrusts of this series, is slightly awkward romance between Jesse and Tulip, and Cassidy as their kind of, again, slightly awkward third wheel.
Yeah, they're playing that up a lot more than they did in the comics, which on the one hand, to an extent, it did sort of veer up a bit in the comics, but on the other hand, it does mean that by the time we get to the bits where it's a major plot element, it might be a bit more of a sense of, oh, thank God, that's banging on for years. I mean, it depends how many years it takes them to get to those plot beats, I guess. But yeah, I felt like we got a good sense of it, but I think Jesse, after perhaps being a bit generic last year, feels slightly more defined as a character this year. I quite like, I've enjoyed him a bit more. Yeah. His sort of single-mindedness comes through a bit more as a character flaw, I think.
Yeah, and obviously this time they've got a clear goal that they're moving towards, such as in that they are trying to find God who is somewhere on Earth. So there's a sense of that. I'm a big fan of stories when like characters have like a clearly defined objective and kind of work towards that. There's always a sense of progression. That's what they do, is kind of, you get the sense is ultimately bringing them towards some kind of conclusion.
Yeah, but the Cassidy character, the vampire, played very well by Joseph Gilgun, which is, as I'm sure I said last time we covered this, still a pretty excellent bit of casting. But he's been a bit more subdued this year, perhaps because they've been hammering the show a bit more into a plot structure. That means they can't have him do quite as many off-the-cuff, incredibly violent things like killing people and ripping them into bits, which is, a shame. But he is still reliably funny. There's a bit in the 4th episode where he does a fun run of jokes related to Game of Thrones, just to relate everything else back to Game of Thrones, which I enjoyed quite a lot.
Yeah, he's still probably my favourite character, Cassidy. He's so well acted and he's got such great comic lines, and the guy's obviously got brilliant comic timing. He's still my favourite part of it, even though maybe he has like less to do this series, but I don't know. I hope they're taking Cassidy somewhere where he gets to do something, at least in one episode.
They've gone to New Orleans in the 3rd and 4th episodes. They're randomly just crashing with this guy Cassidy knows who is letting them stay there, but doesn't speak English and appears to hate him, which I'm sure will come up as a plot point at some stage.
Yeah, and Cassidy doesn't speak French, and so we're not really sure what's going on or why.
Yeah, I've got, maybe we should get our Harry Potter correspondent Claire Russo to watch those scenes and tell us what he's actually saying, because they don't subtitle them. So
yeah, that would be interesting.
I don't know. To be fair, I'm sure I could have Googled and found out if I cared that much. But it's almost just more funny for the joke that they're going for, but you just don't have a clue what he's saying.
Because none of the characters have a clue.
Because no one else knows. He just says things, and Jesse and Cassidy just stare at each other in bafflement. So yeah, I think they're going somewhere with the Cassidy stuff. In fact, yeah, it's a general theme of our comments on these 4 episodes. It feels like they're going somewhere, and we like it. That feels like a definite step up on season 1. It's still quite stylish. Possibly Ruth Negga's Tulip isn't getting quite as much to do as she did last year. I'm not sure. She seems like she's, I don't know, we have got a bit of story digging into her background, to be fair. It's possibly just she's not getting quite as many look at me, I'm awesome sequences.
Yeah, that's a valid point.
Possibly that's just true of everyone. There is a more coherent sense of a mythology developing, rather than a sense that anything could just happen at any moment. Like, they've built in a setup for the mysterious religious organisation, which again, obviously, I know what it is from the comics, which has flowed fairly organically out of the plot and will hopefully come back to bite them soon. I think this is a 13-episode second season, so we've still got about just over 2/3 of it to go.
They are definitely like expanding the universe and bringing in some wider bits and pieces. Like say, there's this shady religious organisation, there's some gangsters that Tulip's mixed up with. There's Cassidy's backstory with this character in New Orleans. Plus, obviously, they're digging more into what's happened with God. Why is he abandoned heaven, and why is he on Earth? So they are kind of like broadening out the universe and developing it.
They're mostly keeping that quite well balanced. Like just as I thought, it seems a bit weird we haven't had any actual development of the looking for God plot. Some actual development happened, even though they are juggling quite a lot of threads. They are just about keeping them all airborne and moving forward at an enjoyable pace.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's ambitious, but I think it's just about working.
Yeah, the other thing I really like about this show in general and this season in particular is how good the dark humour is. Like, it is punctuated by real kind of unpleasant but also unpleasantly funny moments. It can be quite grim, but I get the sense that they're not just going for the lowest common denominator, or they're not trying to be offensive just for offensive's sake. I always felt that like Family Guy was quite bad for this, and I'm not a particular fan of that show that kind of will just put in something that's shocking and offensive and funny because it's like just for the sake of being, a sort of agent provocateur. But I kind of felt there was like, I don't know, there's a bit more of a point to this, in that there's a kind of, they're going with this general sense that the world is sort of morally bankrupt and become quite an awful, disgusting place. Maybe because God has abandoned Earth, or maybe because, I don't know, humans have turned their back on God, or maybe because we just are nasty and corrupt and violent. But the darkness and the kind of horrible, grim, disgusting things that kind of happen in the show that are also quite funny. There does seem to be some sort of thematic point behind it, and it serves some kind of plot element, which is why I think it works better than just being offensive for offensive's sake. Also, the shockingness isn't targeted at one particular group or type of person. It's more general, which I think stops it just being, look, we can do something that's a bit taboo for the sake of it.
Well, yeah, plus there is usually, a regular stop for pathos rather than just, lol, increasing levels of pointless violence. That man's head has just exploded. In episode 1, when there's a massive shootout, there's a bloke who's singing, I think, the Blue Rose of Texas, because Jesse, is it Yellow Rose of Texas?
Yellow Rose.
A song about a rose in Texas. Yeah. Okay, Yellow Rose, because Jesse told him to, using his magic power, because that's what Jesse can do. And then he gets shot because the big evil cowboy turns up, or well, the big cowboy, unstoppable Terminator cowboy assassin thing shows up, and he just sort of lies there dying, still singing the song, and it's genuinely, for a few seconds, played as quite sad. I think there's usually enough, just about enough, this has actual weight to stop it just being, guts, blood, bums, boom.
Yeah, exactly.
It's a thin line, and obviously your mileage may vary on how much you could cope with. That man just got blown up and it's funny, but that man just got blown up and it's sad. Back and forth for like 45 minutes a week. But it's a balance that works very much for me.
Yeah, I think they're doing it well. Like I say, there does seem to be some kind of vague, like, thematic point behind this sort of thing. And yeah, and you're completely right that they do stop for pathos, rather than just kind of being like this sort of, I don't know, Tom and Jerry-esque roller coaster of ultra-violence. Yeah, that works for me, and if they carry on in this vein, I'll be happy. It'd be good if it actually, like, again, like the last series, needs to actually go somewhere and something significant needs to happen at the end. But I guess I'm prepared to stick with it to see what does happen.
Well, yeah, but I don't feel like it's not going somewhere, if that makes sense. The last series, it just meandered quite a lot. This series, I at least have some faith that they're building towards something, so I don't mind that it hasn't happened yet, because we're only a third of the way through. My biggest concern about this series, outside of quality, is that I'm not 100% sure anyone's actually watching it. This is purely from my amazing subjective perspective, and obviously I'm in Britain, so a lot of people I follow on Twitter are in Britain, and no one really cares, or at least I'm not sure the network AMC who make it care that much about whether people in Britain are watching it on Amazon Prime or not. But I don't see that much chatter about it, which does sometimes concern me, but I guess we'll have to wait and see whether it gets renewed. I hope it will, though, because it would be a shame if they finally found their voice only to get cancelled.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I remember last year there was a lot of chatter around the first series when it came out. A lot of friends and people just were asking me, oh, you're watching Preacher? Well, we're watching Preacher, people were very into it, certainly when it first appeared. And, this series, not so much. I remember I was at a bar last night chatting to people about TV, film sort of thing, and was saying, like, so you're watching Preacher? And there's a lot of kind of, no, not really on my radar. I don't know if less people have Amazon Prime than Netflix because it's more expensive, or if it's just the fact that this series hasn't resonated in the way that the first series did, or was less of I guess Series 2 a lot of the time can be less of an event than a brand new Series 1.
Yeah, I haven't seen as much promotion either. But, I mean, obviously, I guess with a second season, just sort of relying on the fact people liked season 1, maybe it just didn't make enough impact. I don't know. Anyway, we'll see, I guess. It's usually at some point within the next few months. Usually either around the end of the season or a month or so after. So for now, I should probably just try and relax and just watch it and not have to worry about renewal once it's finished. But yeah, as quality-wise, yes, I think this is good. I think this is a good positive step forward, and although it still, as I say, could perhaps do with, at times, with a bit more realness, in my opinion, to counter the silliness, although that might just be me comparing it to the comics. Yes, I am enjoying it a lot more now. Good show, Preacher. Okay, and lastly this fortnight we'll be talking about Descender, the comic I recommended Alastair last week. This is a sci-fi series about a robot called Tim-21 who discovers that his programming, or his robot DNA or codex, has something in common with a massive destructive series of robots that materialised several years beforehand and caused mass destruction and a wave of anti-robot racism to spread across the universe after that. So he ends up in a big search for the truth about these robots, and a group of people working for the military or the Galactic Council or whatever are tasked with keeping him alive and out of the hands of various bounty hunters and other strange, curious groups. And robot sci-fi, basically, written by Jeff Lemire and drawn by Dustin Nguyen. We've read the first volume, Tin Stars, which collects the first 6 issues. Alastair, what did you think?
It was really nice. I really like this. I'm a big fan of science fiction as a genre. This kind of really played to some of my favourite bits of science fiction. It was kind of, space opera set across, multiple planets, far future, big spaceships, robots, lots of things I really like. So this is very much in my wheelhouse, as we say on the podcast. One of the things that stood out most about the comic straight away is the artwork is really interesting and unusual. It's it's very stylish, slightly abstract, sort of watercolor style. And then
I think so. Yeah.
Yeah. It looks much more like it's been painted rather than drawn, although I'm not actually sure what the technical approach actually is, but it looks very beautiful, and the kind of characters are sort of indistinct, but in a kind of distinct way, which I know sounds a bit like a contradiction, but it's kind of, sometimes it's hard to tell where the boundaries of characters are and when the background starts, but everyone looks very individual, so you have an idea of what every character sort of is and is like. And there's a very good plot, about this robot, his codex, the giant robots called the Harvesters that have turned up to destroy everything, and the anti-robot racism that's broken out because of this. So, good plot, interesting art, sci-fi setting, very much ticks all my boxes.
And Dustin Nguyen does draw very good robots. Like the sort of Tim 21 is a child companion robot, so he looks like a child, but he's also capable of his body sort of opening up, sort of Terminator style, to display the robot parts within, which does give Dustin Nguyen the opportunity to draw this sort of body opening up into a robot, which he does do very, very beautifully. Those are some nice panels. Yeah,
and the other robots that appear again look really good. There's a sort of mechanical sort of inhumanity about them that they do kind of look like machines and kind of and not people.
Yeah, the plot sort of hops from planet to planet, or from venue to venue, or location to location would be the word I was actually looking for. And it does give Nguyen a chance to draw a lot of different species and different robots, which he seems to really enjoy. There's a lot of very sort of excited looking images of new things appearing and their sort of exciting new design as they burst into action or smash their way to the room, which often seems to happen.
And there's an interesting cast of characters. There's Tim 21. There's the sort of scientist who created the robots. He's the father of modern robotics and responsible for a big step forward in the processing power and the kind of effectiveness and intelligence of robots. And obviously he's been blamed by the fact that giant killer robots turned up out of nowhere to murder everyone, so he's probably responsible in some way as the father of modern robotics.
Yeah, I think all the characters are quite... There's a very sort of nice light touch to it, which I quite enjoy. The sort of the characterisation. I mean, on the one hand, I suppose it can make them also feel quite light and quite thin, but I think the characters are very sort of obvious and defined. You get a fairly good feel for what they're like fairly soon after they appear, without anyone having to deliver a monologue or an expositionary bit about what this person is like. It comes across very clearly on the page between the dialogue and the art, which is sort of obvious good writing, I guess.
Yeah,
it's not that quippy, which is often unusual for comics, and it's kind of refreshing. Characters are sort of likable and clear cut, but without the need for zappy dialogue. It just feels comparatively natural, which plays quite well, obviously, against the sci-fi setting and the things exploding and the masses of weird robots that keep turning up.
Yeah, they really do a good job of introducing the kind of this whole future universe in this first volume, in that, there's the anti-robot movement, there's a planet that some of the action takes place on that is vociferously anti-robots. There's a group called the Robot Underground, who obviously we get the sense of maybe some kind of, robots who are against their kind of oppression. There's various political groups. There's a kind of galactic governing body that the main characters sort of work for. But it starts out as kind of the dominant force in future society, and is obviously weakened by the fact that they were attacked by these harvesters. So all of that is quite aptly sort of introduced and set up in the first volume without it feeling like you're getting a lecture in the politics or society of the future. So that was well done.
The plot on the one hand does sometimes feel a bit sort of hop from place to place. Every issue, roughly speaking, they go somewhere new and often meet a new range of hostile things. But on the other hand, that does, I think, for the first storyline, give you a good sort of overview of the universe, even if the way they've sort of pulled the characters around to do that sometimes feels a bit forced. It's quite a nice way of making you feel like you've seen everything and you're fully invested. Other comics or similar TV shows, I guess, would just have multiple characters in multiple destinations, venues, locations. the word location is just not with me today. I've dislocated myself. There are multiple characters in multiple locations and just hop between them, but the sender seems to have decided, no, this is a comic about these characters on a journey, so we're just going to, take them to each different place and they can experience it for themselves, which does at least very much get you in the mood of, okay, this is a comic about these characters on a road trip. I now understand how these characters relate to each other, and I've seen a wide cross-section of the universe.
Yeah, it's good that it's focused on these characters and their story. There's not a lot of jumping around to different places. I like the fact that there's not, there is kind of one main plot thread, and it's these characters experiencing the plot in a linear format, which makes it easy to follow. It gives them time to kind of develop those characters and their story, because it's the primary focus.
There's a bit of backstory stuff, like in the issue, I think it's issue 2 technically. Was it issue 2? Issue 2 or issue 3, there's a lot of flashbacks to Tim 21's background. Like, I think every other page hops back from the present day action to show a montage of his life before this sort of big harvester apocalypse happened. I mean, again, that was, if nothing else, that was some lovely art. Those sort of big flashback montage pages where everything sort of merges together, like multiple images into one picture, which is still somehow incredibly easy to follow. There's some gorgeous comics work by Dustin Nguyen. And yes, it just brings everything across very evocatively.
Yeah, that stuff was very good. And, it's interesting how they filled in the story of Tim and, the robot boy searching for some sort of love and acceptance amongst humans is a story that's been done before, but I felt this was, at least a good execution of that story, as well as a sort of slightly different take on it. But yeah, you're right, that the artwork for that section was beautiful, and it kind of, the way that everything kind of blurred together showed the way that kind of memories are sort of blurred and mixed in together, and they're not kind of clear cut. And so by putting together the art for the comic, that works really well. It is just beautiful to look at. It can't be overstated just how beautiful, and well drawn and realised the art of this comic is. Yeah,
I mean, as we've sort of discussed before, you said this is a very sort of nowadays sci-fi future. There's a very sort of white Apple look to it, it's very much an iPod future. And I guess, sort of as you say, cute boy robots in a sort of Apple-inflected future is possibly a bit standard nowadays. So yeah, again, if you wanted to criticise the sender, it is just kind of taking reasonably well-worn sci-fi tropes out for a little walk. But it is a very well-written and well-drawn walk. If you like this sort of thing, then it's 100% worth a look.
The story is good. That's the main thing. I mean, there's only a certain number of stories in any genre, and there are obviously similarities between this story and previous sci-fi stories been told before, but the characters are engaging, the plot is interesting, it's well-paced. That's what matters, which is why I would highly recommend this to sci-fi fans out there, because it's got all the key elements of sci-fi stories that people like, and it is engaging read. One of the things I like to say is that there's not kind of original or cliched concepts. There's only original cliched executions. Everything's been done. It's just how you tell the story, and this story is well executed.
Yeah, there's not really a bit where the writer has to stop and go, all right, lads, let me just whip out my amazing new high concept. The concept pretty much explains itself. The characters are right there on the page, but it does at least mean you can, get straight into the actual journey of the characters, both their physical and emotional journey. And yeah, as a result, a lot of the sort of character moments and a couple of nice twists towards the end do land really, really well. So it does all go towards actually telling the story rather than being smug or clever about it. So you can't really argue with that, I guess.
Yeah. The thing it reminded me the most of, as a science fiction fan, is it kind of really reminded me of Mass Effect, the video game series. But Mass Effect has been a big, very successful video game, especially amongst sci-fi fans, has had quite a lot of influence on the genre. I mean, it does feel very similar to Mass Effect in that there's things like a pan-galactic civilization of many races and robots that sort of living together and in sort of peace and harmony, or relative peace and harmony, and then they're attacked by a big, evil, external, super powerful robot race. So obviously there's similarities to Mass Effect in that way. But like I say, Mass Effect weren't the first people to kind of present that future. The Mass Effect vision of the future was inspired by Star Wars and other sort of classic science fiction novels. It's more the fact that this is I think in a sort of continuing sort of line of galaxy-spanning future space opera approach, which this seems kind of the next step in that line, a line that goes from some classic sci-fi via Star Wars to Mass Effect to this.
Oh, I have seen Star Wars eventually. I haven't obviously read that much sci-fi in this area, so I defer to you as the historical expert.
This did really remind me of the science fiction you get more in sci-fi novels than necessarily what you get in films or even TV, in that it's a big, rich, expansive world. Films and TV shows tend to be much more focused, and that's because you've got to tell a quite tight story, especially in films. Which I generally, I think science fiction films set in our world or relatively near the present day kind of work better because you haven't got as much to fill in like you kind of hour and a half you've got to tell your story, whereas like a big sci-fi novel or video game series like Mass Effect, that's kind of, you can play the first Mass Effect game for like 60 hours. There's a lot of scope to flesh out plot and universe. They're the same in like, a 500-page novel. You can do a lot of universe fleshing out as well as telling a good story. Not so much in an hour and a half, or even in like 10-hour-long TV shows. So you kind of, it's a very different type of science fiction you get from having this greater scope. And this did really feel much more like that kind of more expansive, more complex, further away from our reality science fiction that I really like. Like I say, the stuff you get in a lot of sort of classic sci-fi novels, and also you get in sci-fi games like Mass Effect.
Yeah, I mean, indeed, yeah. The series is still going. It's up to about issue 20-something now. So obviously they're going to go for a while. And yeah, this first storyline does give you the sense that this is something that, has a lot of scope and could continue for a good few volumes, which, as I say, happily it's been quite successful, so it probably will. Although, as I moaned both last week and on my Radio Free Fandom guest appearance, hasn't been nominated for a Hugo Award for some reason. Even though it's about spaceships and robots and stuff, which they're meant to like. Never mind. Okay, so after the shocking twist of me recommending Alastair something science fiction-y and him liking it, what are you recommending me next episode?
Well, I started this episode by talking about comedy, so I'm going to finish by recommending you some comedy, in that I'm going to recommend you the first and only series of the sitcom Nathan Barley.
Oh,
it's
okay.
a really interesting, unusual sitcom, very much from the awkward Office / Alan Partridge sense of kind of cringe humour. Peep Show, and also, another great example of that genre. And it's an interesting, came out, I don't know, over 10 years ago, and it gets a lot of credit for predicting kind of the modern hipster sort of Shoreditch culture. I haven't actually rewatched it, so it'd be interesting to see if that kind of, the legend of Nathan Barley stands up. But it is very funny and very cringy, so I hope you like it.
Even though it is a bit of a legendary show and definitely in my wheelhouse, and I believe co-written by Charlie Brooker, isn't it? It was Chris Morris and Charlie Brooker.
Yeah, they're the writers, yeah. And it's got a lot of people you'll recognise, like Richard Ayoade, Noel Fielding, lots and lots of well-known people from TV sitcoms you'll recognise in it. Yeah,
this is definitely one of the many things that I should have seen. I look forward to seeing it. Okay, and that was Moderate Fantasy Violence. Thank you very much for listening. If you've enjoyed this experience, then why not go to moderatefantasyviolence.com for more things, including the occasional bonus audio clip and or essay by myself and Alastair. And you can also subscribe on iTunes if you don't already, and leave us a nice review, please, because we value them and they make us feel good. Plus, I hear they get the show out to more people.
You can follow us on various social media sites. If you go to Facebook, then you can search for Moderate Fantasy Violence and our purple logo will pop up. You can also follow us on Twitter, where we're at MFV Podcast. And as a little bonus, something Nick mentioned at the top of the show, we would like to know more about you, our listeners. So we put together a little listener survey about you and the sort of stuff you're into. There's the chance you could win a £20 Amazon gift voucher, so giving us your opinion could earn you money. So if you're interested in filling in our survey with your chance to win some money, either look for the link in the show notes to this episode or pop over to our Twitter feed at MFV Podcast, and the link will be in the pinned tweet at the top. I've been Alastair Ball. If you want more from me, you can listen to my appearance on a new podcast called Radio Free Fandom, a podcast created by Claire Rousseau, who's been on the show a few times as our Harry Potter correspondent. So if you go and listen to the most recent episode of that, you can hear me and Claire talking about Game of Thrones. If you really want more Game of Thrones, and who doesn't? Game of Thrones is the best thing ever. You can also, if you want more from me, follow me on Twitter, where I'm at Alastair J.R. Ball, or you can visit my website, redtrainblog.com.
Okay, and I've been Nick Bryant. You can find me on the internet at nickbryant.com. New content coming soon with increasing speed in the terms of actual fiction written by me, although not in prose form this time. I'm also on Twitter as at NickMB, and in fact, if you go to the episode before last on Radio Free Fandom, you can hear me talking about this year's Hugo Award comic nominees. I don't just complain about Descender not being nominated. I do also talk a bit about the ones that actually were nominated, just to be clear. And yep, that really is it for this fortnight. We'll be back in 2 weeks, and on this occasion we'll be covering Dunkirk, the new war movie from Christopher Nolan, which, to be honest, I mostly know for having Harry Styles in it, but I gather there's also a plot. And we'll also be talking about It Comes at Night, a new horror film, and the new Castlevania animated series written by comic writer Warren Ellis. And lastly, as Alastair said earlier, we'll be talking about Nathan Barley and whether we're now living in it. That's all. Thank you very much for listening. Goodbye.
Bye. Shall I tee up the next recommendation? I keep saying it's like the fourth time I've said tee up today.
Look, if you want to go and play golf, then at least let's finish the podcast first.